As I was introduced, I teach full-time, and I do enjoy going out and talking to professionals. This is a big change, this contract. We haven't seen anything close to this since 2014. But frankly, I think this is a bigger change because they reformatted the entire agreement. And one of the things I like about what they've done is they've reorganized it. Past changes, and usually they update the contract about every 5 years. It seems they just kind of fit it in. And this time they revamped it, but they didn't just revamp the purchase agreement, the RPA. They also revamped the residential income, the vacant land, the commercial property, the notice of default purchase agreement. All of them are going to be given to this new form style with this grid format that you're going to find in paragraph 3. So the reason I want you to restrict your comments in the chat to questions to me, I will be going into the chat frequently to look at those questions. If there's a bunch of hellos, how you doing? It's going to take me longer to get to the questions. And I want to get to your questions, and I will answer all of your questions. I've also put my email into the chat. Like I was introduced, I'm not here to give legal advice. I will not give legal advice. But if you have a question on the form, okay, you can shoot me an email, and I'm happy to answer that. I do that as part of my outreach here at Mount SAC. So let's go ahead and get into the form. Of course, the first thing you see in page 1 is that grid staring at you in paragraph 3. We're going to get to that in a few minutes. I want to get to the introductory material first. For those of you who are experienced, I don't mean to bore you, but it's always good to kind of revisit things as we go through. And of course, in paragraph 1, we have the offer where we identify the buyer, the property address by street address, city, county, zip code, and assessor parcel number. A couple items here. We see up there where it says date prepared. That's only to give this contract a name. If you're going to counter this contract, if you're going to add an addendum to this contract, you want to add it to the purchase agreement dated such and such a date. Remember, all of your timeframes are going to go from the date of signature for the buyer or the date of acceptance in the case of the seller, or the buyer if there's a counter offer. So timeframes go from dates of signature and acceptances, whereas the name of this contract dated whatever date you put on the top there. Be sure to put in all of your buyers. This contract does prohibit assignment without the seller's permission. We'll get to that a little bit later in the agreement. You'll also notice that the line for the assessor parcel number is excessively long. CAR has increased the line there to deal with the anticipation of additional parcel numbers as we're seeing properties subdivided with ADUs added to them, that kind of thing. Remember, the state is really pushing to increase housing. So we may see properties that were traditionally single-family dwellings having now multiple APNs as they're getting subdivided to provide additional housing. So that's why that is there. So just FYI on that. All right. Remember, the buyer and the seller are other parties. Brokers and agents are not parties to this agreement. We are not parties to this agreement as agents. Where that really is critical, if you're writing an offer on a for sale by owner, I know sometimes some agents will put their commission in the offer. Don't do that. You're not a party to the agreement, therefore it would be unenforceable. Don't do that because the statute of frauds requires that there be a disclosure in 10-point bold type or red lettering stating that commissions are negotiable, not fixed by law. That's not in this agreement, which makes it more unenforceable. If you're going to create a commission agreement with an unrepresented party, like a for sale by owner or an unlisted property owner, you want to use that SP form, single party compensation agreement. All right, let's move on. Agency. It's very similar to what you're used to. You're writing the offer on behalf of your buyer. You will put for buyer's brokerage firm, eHomes, and then you will put your individual name as buyer's agent, and you will put your license numbers to the right then. You will then put in the seller's brokerage firm. That's easy to determine. That's the name that's on the for sale sign out in front of the house. And of course, the agent you're dealing with, who is taking care of that listing on behalf of the brokerage firm, and their license as well. And then designate who's representing the seller, who's representing the buyer. Remember, if eHomes is representing both buyer and seller, you are in dual agency. If eHomes is only representing one of the parties, you are in single agency. You are in the same agency relationship as eHomes is, okay? And again, if you're completing this in zip forms, it's automatically going to fill it in for you. The danger arises if you're filling this out of the office on the hood of somebody's car or in somebody's house or something like that. You need to make sure how that agency is confirmed. Your agency disclosure was done well in advance. Remember, when you're representing the seller, you need to disclose agency to that seller before they sign the listing. That's required under Civil Code 2079. If you are representing the buyer, you really should have that buyer sign that agency disclosure form before you start showing them properties. And while you're at it, make sure they also sign that possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, that PRBS form, okay? Representing the buyer. I know when you usually get those forms signed before you write the offer, right? Please, lots of reasons. I really don't have time for it. If it comes up in the chat, I'll address it. But you need to disclose agency and get that PRBS signed with your buyer before you start taking them out and show you properties. That will give you greater protection. All right. You got to get those forms signed anyway. Get them signed well in advance so you get the greatest benefit from those forms. All right. So going to move on. We will stop for questions later at the end of the page. I already see some stuff coming up in the chats already. All right. So number 3, paragraph 3 is the biggie. Okay. This is the one that scares everybody when we look at this contract. But I gotta give CAR credit. When I first saw the draft of this, I wasn't too excited about this new form. I'm starting to like it now because I think it's going to make your life easier if you're paying attention. But you do need to pay attention, because if you're not, you can get yourself in trouble. And what I mean by paying attention is the last 13 pages are important too. It's not just the first 3 pages, particularly paragraph 3. It's the entire contract. In addition, look at the last sentence or the last 2 sentences in the verbiage of paragraph 3 above the grid, where it says this form is 16 pages. The parties are advised to read all 16 pages. Now, you guys and me, we're going to know what this contract means just by paragraph 3. But lawyers, buyers, sellers, they're not going to know what these terms mean or how they're used. If you're familiar with the existing purchase agreement, you're going to be familiar with this, because most of the meaning has not changed. It's just in a different format. All right, so now let's explain the grid. So on the far left-hand side, or I like to call column number 1, there being 5 columns as you go from left to right here. Column number 1 is the paragraphs of this form, 3A, B, C, D1, D2, etc. Okay. Column 2 identifies the paragraph later in this agreement that deals with the same topic as this paragraph. Okay. So 3A talks about the purchase price. Well, there's other information dealing about the purchase price that needs to be stated in writing, and that's found in paragraph 5. So what's going to happen? And supposedly one of or both of these things will happen by the time this form rolls out in mid-January. If you take your cursor and hover over 3A to the right of it, where you see paragraph 5, if you hover over that, paragraph 5 is going to pop up in this screen. So you're actually going to see paragraph 5. Now, if you click on that paragraph 5 under 3A, it will take you to paragraph 5. And in paragraph 5, where it talks about 3A, if you click on that, it'll take you back here to 3A. Isn't that cool? Both of them hopefully will be available in mid-December. I guess Zip Forms has promised CAR at least one of them will be available. We'll see. Okay, so these are coming attractions. All right. All right. So then in column 3, we have the purchase price identified. Column 4, we type in the amount of purchase price. And then under additional terms, if it's going to be in all cash, you click that. Now, as we go down into paragraph 3B, close of escrow, terms and conditions, we can do number of days or a specific date. Now, you're going to notice that some of these blanks in here are a little small. And you're saying, you know, I might need to write a little bit more information here. And I don't have enough room. What am I going to do? If you start typing the information in one of these blanks and you exceed the space, a new addendum will pop up called the TOP. All right. Now that TOP addendum will only be visible. It will only be available if you exceed the character space in one of these lines. Even if you go into the Zip Forms library and you look for the TOP, not going to be there. It only populates if you exceed a space in these lines, and then all that language is transferred over. Pretty cool, huh? Very interactive form, right? So 3C is your expiration of offer, like the current agreement, 3 days from buyer signature, or you can make it a specific date. The initial deposit, you will put in the number in column 4 there in 3D1, and then it will automatically populate what percentage of the purchase price it is. That way you know if you're going over that 3%. Remember, for liquidated damages, if the buyer intends to occupy the property as a personal residence, the amount of deposit being withheld by the seller as liquidated damages cannot exceed 3%. So that'll be a clue there. Also, when we get down into the loan, it'll give you the percentage of the loan. Remember, the sweet spot for loans is what, 20% or more? So it'll be an easy way to identify that. All right. Okay, so we've got the initial deposit there in terms and conditions, column 4. And then we go to column 5, the deadline to get the deposit to escrow is 3 business days, okay, after acceptance. Or you can check the box and put other terms. But again, you do not want to take receipt of that check. You do not want to make a photocopy of that check. You do not want to touch that check, mostly because there is no check. Because if you look in column 5 under 3D1, it's going to be done by wire transfer. Now, if the buyer doesn't like wire transfer and they want to take a check down to escrow, you could check the box and put in buyer's personal check. But remember, make sure the buyer delivers the check to escrow. You don't want to touch that check. You don't even want to make a copy of that check. How many times have we put something in the photocopy machine and forgot it, right? You do that with a check, okay? That's called commingling. And that's really bad for your license. Like, you'll lose your license for that. So again, don't do that. Okay, so then going down to 3D2, this is for an increase of deposit, all right? I don't like increase of deposits. I think it creates more work for you. I think it creates more liability for you. So I think it's easier just to do the initial deposit. Now, how much should your initial deposit be? I get that question a lot. Well, I like $10,000. I don't like it to be above $10,000 because $10,000 is the cap or the limit of small claims court. If it goes more than $10,000, and now there's a dispute between buyer and seller over the deposit, you've got to lawyer up and go into superior court. that can take years. Small claims court, month and a half. You go before what? Judge Wapner, Judge Judy, whoever, and they resolve it. Okay. If you're in a situation where the property does truly warrant a greater deposit, or you've been told by the listing agent you need to bring in a greater deposit, if you're going over 10,000, I strongly recommend including the arbitration clause, because if you do that, now, rather than going into court, you can go to arbitration. Now, you can certainly lawyer up in arbitration, but here's my thinking. If you've got a buyer and or seller who has a property or is in a transaction that warrants a $15,000, $20,000 deposit, I will bet you they are probably sophisticated enough to go into arbitration without an attorney and explain to the arbitrator why they should get the money back or why they should get the money, right? So anyway, that's my thinking. Happy to talk about it more, but let's move on to the contract. Let's go down to 3E1, the loan amount. The first thing you'll notice here is that it is a fixed rate conventional, okay? If you want to go with the government, you've got to go into column 5 and check FHA or VA, all right? Also in column 4 under 3E1, you'll notice buyer to pay 0 points, all right? 0 points. If your loan is going to have points, then you go ahead and put them in, but 0 points and whatever the interest rate is. You'll notice that the FHA VA deliver list of lender requirements will be done 17 days. In the current contract, most of our contingency periods are 17 days. The noticeable exception is loan, and that is 21 days. This contract changes that. Everything is now 17 days. And I think that makes sense because if you have a loan contingency of 21 days and all your other contingencies are 17 days, you're put in a position, if you're the seller, of having to give 2 notice to performs to the buyer if they're not releasing contingencies. Remember, you can give a notice 2 days early. So you could give one on the 15th and the other one on the 19th. And that's kind of a pain. You're replicating your work. So we're going to make all the loan contingency 17 days. You're welcome to change the loan contingencies if you want to. So if you want to make them longer, you can. If you want to make them shorter, I don't recommend that, but you can. Just make sure you have a reason to do it, okay? Because if you're changing the time frames, since everybody else is basing their actions on the default timeframes, the 17 days, you're going to have a chance of missing deadlines, and you don't want to do that. Okay. So again, I caution against changing the timeframes unless you have a really, really, really good reason to. All right. Also, over in additional terms, you'll see that the HVAC form and the HID form will automatically attach if you're going with a government loan. So if you check FHA or VA in column 5, then it's automatically going to attach that FVAC form and the HID form. What are those forms? Those forms contain the mandatory regulatory language required by the federal government when you're dealing with an FHA or VA loan. Also, they also addressed that that deposit cannot be used as liquidated damages or non-refundable if the appraisal has not come in at the purchase price. Okay, there's nothing you can do to change that. Remember, you cannot contract around or contract against a statutory law. If the statute, either federal or state, requires something, you have to do it. You cannot contract against that. Okay, so please don't hit me questions on how can I make a deposit in an FHA or a VA loan non-refundable. You can't. So let's not even go there. All right, because again, I don't want to make a federal case out of this, but it's federal law. It is a federal case. All right. Okay, just joking around. I'll get to your chats when I get to the bottom of here. All right. If you've got secondary financing, E2, will provide that information. Again, it reads just like E1 does, 0 points, conventional, unless you go with something else like seller financing, fixed rate. If you want to go adjustable rate, you can put that in there. You'll notice something else, and I'll probably talk to you a little bit more as we go later in the contract. But if you go back up to E1, the third column, if FHA or VA is checked, deliver list of lender required repairs within 17 days. That FVA form that you're currently using is going to go away. We're now going to have, or we're going to use, the request for repairs form. You see, with an FHA or a VA loan, that lender may require certain repairs to the property. That's really a request for repairs, right? And with a VA loan, okay, lender may require the seller to pay some costs, right? That's kind of like a request for repairs too, right? So the request for repairs form is being updated, and it's going to have a section in there to address FHA and VA repairs and financial contributions from the seller, okay? A CAR decided, why do we have two forms that essentially do the same thing? So the FVA form is being eliminated, and its content is going to be adapted to the RR form or the request for repairs, right? Going down to E3, okay, occupancy type, got some new boxes here for you. So if you don't check a box, primary residence, right? And I think most of your transactions are with buyers who are going to use the property as the primary residence. We have another box for a secondary residence. This would be a vacation home, weekend cottage, or something like that. We also have a box for investment, okay? In other words, this property is being purchased essentially to rent out. Why do we have the three boxes? Well, loan amounts or interest rates or down payment amounts might be different with secondary, certainly with investment from a primary residence. Interest rates would be different, typically higher, okay? And then also, remember, the buyer only has the protection of that 3% cap on liquidated damages if it's a primary residence, not if it's a secondary or investment. Balance of down payment will be put into F automatically. Again, just like the current form, it'll automatically add those up for you. Purchase price total will appear then at the bottom, all right? Just one more practice point. If you're dealing with an FHA, or excuse me, FHA, if you're dealing with a VA loan, remember VA loans will go with 100% financing, which means you could have a negative amount in line or box F because the buyer's deposit essentially is getting rebated back to them because the loan amount and the purchase price are the same, all right? So if you're filling this form out in the field, which I don't recommend you do the first couple of times, you need to account for that, all right? But if you're using zip forms, you're doing it on your computer online, it'll automatically total them up for you. Okay, so we're now in paragraph 3G, okay? If there's going to be a seller credit, we put in the specific amount, all right? And it will also show the percentages, right? The default language in column 5, seller credit will be applied to closing costs. If you want to change that, we put it in there. Goes without saying, any monies between buyer and seller being exchanged, all right, particularly monies from the seller to the buyer, needs to be listed in this contract. If it's something later that's been agreed to, it needs to go through escrow. Passing money from seller to buyer without lender's knowledge constitutes or could constitute loan fraud. Loan fraud can be punished with up to $1 million fine and 30 years in federal prison. Either one of which is not fun. I don't say that from experience. I've never done that, but you don't want to even go there, all right? If you have some additional finance terms, we have that for G2, but this should be for terms regarding financing. Of course, the most common additional financing terms was seller credit. Of course, CAR has given a space for that. So, but if you have something else, it can go in there. And then we go down to three, H1, H2, and H3. Got some changes here, all right? So if you've got an all cash offer, proof of that money must be attached to this offer, all right? In the current version, it is to be included, okay? If you check the box, you have 3 days to do that. The change is H2 and H3, verification of down payment and closing costs and verification of loan application, those are also going to be attached to this offer. In the current version, they're to be given in 3 days, unless you check the box, then they're attached. In the current version of the contract, it's inconsistent. You have one rule for the all cash, but you have a different rule for the verification of down payment and closing costs and the loan application. So CIR has made them consistent. You will provide verification of cash if it's an all cash offer. You will provide verification of down payment and closing costs if there's a loan. You will provide verification of loan application if it's a loan with the offer. If you're not providing it with the offer, then you will check the corresponding box and provide it in 3 days. If you need more time, you have blanks to fill them in. Now, let's go down to H3, column 5. We've got some new boxes here. Or actually, we've got new stuff here. Remember, in the current version, it says the buyer has been pre-qualified or pre-approved. We now have pre-qualified, pre-approved, and a new item, fully underwritten pre-approval. Okay, so first challenge. None of these terms have been defined. Maybe in a later version of this contract, they'll give definitions, but because these definitions are a little bit nebulous anyway, they have not been defined. Let me give you my definition, which coincidentally is CAR's definition, right? Pre-qualification. The buyer has met with a lender, maybe over the phone. The buyer has given a verbal on their income, their debts, how much money they have in the bank, other assets, and the lender has run a credit check. And based on that, they are qualified to get the loan. Now, we don't know if the buyer's been truthful or not, but based on their representations, that's pre-qualification. Pre-approval is the lender has actually verified that. They've actually looked at their tax return, they looked at their pay stub, looked at their bank statements, they've run their credit, they know what's outstanding on their credit card statement, or maybe they got a copy of their credit card statement. That's pre-approval. What's this new one? Fully underwritten pre-approval. Fully underwritten pre-approval means this loan has actually gone into underwriting. The underwriter in the analysis phase has gone through everything, and the lender has said, this buyer can get the loan. We're good, except for the appraisal. The only thing we're missing here is the appraisal, but if the property appraises at the purchase price, it's a done deal. We have approval. That's what fully underwritten pre-approval is. So why do we have this new category? Well, a fully underwritten pre-approval buyer should now be able to compete with a cash offer, right? Because even with the cash offer, you have the appraisal contingency, because you always have appraisal contingency unless you remove it. So the thinking from CAR, and I like this thinking, is that we want to make it clear that this fully underwritten pre-approved buyer is now just as qualified as the all cash buyer. Okay, so that's what that is all about. Okay, moving into I. What's this intentionally left blank? What's going on here? What's CIR trying to do? Well, 3I looks a lot like 31. And later we're going to see 3O is also left blank because 3O looks a lot like 30. And CIR did not want to have a 3I and a 3O along with a paragraph 31 and 30. So that's what that is. It's just to avoid a little confusion in your transactions. Not that you don't have enough confusion in transactions, right? Okay, so J, verification of condition, 5 days prior to close escrow. This is your final walkthrough. No real change here. And then assignment request. So In the current version of the contract, it prohibits assignment without seller's approval. This contract does the same thing, but adds some greater clarity. Now, we can get into this a little more when we get into paragraph 23, because you'll see paragraph 23 is right next to 3K. That's why I know it's paragraph 23. I'm not a master at this form quite yet, but I'm getting there, all right? So in paragraph 23, when we get to it, you're going to see that if the buyer would like to transfer or assign the purchase to an additional spouse or their spouse, let's say they're buying it in their name and they want to add their spouse on, that's okay. If they want to transfer it into their trust, that's okay. Or into a corporation or LLC, which they are the sole owner. We often refer to this as an alter ego. It's basically them, only a different form. That does not require seller approval, okay? So transferring an alter entity like a trust does not require seller approval. However, if you're going to transfer it to a third party, okay, the buyer has 17 days to make that request to the seller, and seller's approval or disapproval, or let's say seller's approval, will not be unreasonably denied, right? However, if the buyer waits till after 17 days, the seller is not obligated to approve the assignment. They can deny the assignment, and that is considered to be reasonable. Also, if the buyer is receiving compensation from the assignee for assigning this contract to them, they have to disclose to the seller how much money they're receiving. So what CIR is trying to do is prevent this practice of what some people call warehousing, where you put a property under contract and then you try to sell your rights to somebody else. That requires seller approval, and you have to get seller's approval, okay? You have to disclose to seller how much money you're receiving from this assignment, and you've got to do it within 17 days. After 17 days, seller doesn't have to approve it, all right? Let's move on. Into paragraph L, dealing with contingencies. Now, this is probably one of my favorite parts of the new contract. They've got all the contingencies in one spot. The first two contingencies, loan and appraisal, you'll notice time to remove those is 17 days. And if you want to release these contingencies going in, for example, with your all cash offer, you can do that by checking the no loan contingency, no appraisal contingency, okay? Those are the only two contingencies you can release with this contract. If you want to release the next 5 contingencies, you've got to attach the contingency removal form, which is listed there in column 5, all right? Now, notice all the contingencies are 17 days. However, on those contingencies that require buyer action, all right, such as review of documents, review of the title report, common interest disclosures, leased or liened items, those are those solar panels that were put up there with a HERO or a PACE loan. It's 17 days or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later. So this is actually in the current version of the contract, but it's not worded quite as clear. So how long does the buyer have with their inspection, investigation, review contingencies? They have 17 days from acceptance. If, however, the seller gives a late disclosure or a late document, then it is going to be 5 days after that. So if the seller, and we'll find back in paragraph 14, the seller has 7 days, just as they do now, to make all disclosures. But let's say they make a late disclosure on the 10th day, okay? Well, 5 plus 10 is 15. You're still running on the 17th day. But let's say they make a late disclosure on day 15. 15 plus 5 is 20. The buyer's going to have 20 days, going to have 20 days from acceptance. So the buyer has 17 days after acceptance or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to all of you. If it doesn't, we got the check, right? Let's go up to L3. So the investigation of the property, that's a contingency. So they've got 17 days to investigate the property. It's not 5 days after a receipt because there's no receipt for investigation of the property. So they have 17 days to investigate the property. But also they have 17 days to have access to the property. And that's not a contingency. So even if you remove all your contingencies, still have access to the property to measure for carpet, furniture, things like that. That's actually a covenant. That's a promise. And if for some reason the seller does not give access or does not allow the buyer into the property during that 17 days, seller's arguably in breach of the contract. Okay, so again, not a contingency, it's actually a covenant. All right. So really the only ones that worry about these are lawyers, but for lawyers, there's a big difference between covenants and contingencies, right? And then, of course, if you want to have this purchase contingent on the buyer selling their old home, you can check the box in L8, attach the COP form. If you haven't looked at the COP form in a couple of years, it was updated about, oh golly, was it a year ago, 6 months ago? I'm getting old, I'm starting to forget these things. But anyway, it was updated. It's now about a page and a half. It's a tougher read. So take a little time in reading it, and you've got to read it from the perspective of the buyer. So when you read that COP form and trying to understand it, it's a little confusing. Think, okay, I'm the buyer here and I've got to sell a house first. Now read that, and I think it'll make it a lot easier for you to get through. All right. One other thing, I'll probably talk about this later, the non-contingent offer. Does that mean it's a done deal? Not necessarily, because most transactions will involve a transfer disclosure statement, right? Some of them will require the fire hardening and defensible space disclosure. Some will require the lead-based paint disclosure, all right? NHD, right? All of those carry a rescission period. So let's talk about the TDS. Personal receipt of the TDS, 3 days. Mail receipt of the TDS, whether it's email or snail mail, 5 days. If you have a non-contingent offer, can the buyer still walk away? Well, yes, within 3 days of receipt of the TDS. Now, some of you are thinking, yay, we're saved. We can start writing on contingent offer. Wait a minute. You don't know if that property or that seller is TDS exempt or not. So you don't know going in. So please be very careful here. Just because you've got some statutory cancellation rights, you may not, depending on the seller or the property. Okay, so FYI on it. So just be careful. Just remember, you cannot contract away these statutory rights. So even if you put in other terms, buyer waives review of TDS, NHD, lead-based paint, can't do it because you can't release or waive a statutory right. Okay, so just be careful on that. All right, so we're going to move through, get to the end of this page, and then I'm going to go into the chat. Okay, so going to paragraph M, possession. Okay, so time of possession is upon notice of recording, or you can do 6 p.m. on the date of recording. Okay, notice of recording. Kind of depends on how the county recorder's office is doing. Where I did most of my practice down in San Diego, it was usually by 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, unless of course it's Friday or the end of the month. And then it's 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right? Because they're all backed up because of that. Everybody gets backed up on Fridays and the end of the month. Ventura is notorious about not telling you till the next day. So that could vary with your county. So you might want to consider the 6 p.m. Just remember, seller, you need to be out at time of possession. And sometimes sellers are moving out the day of closing, right? So again, be right there. If you've got a tenant occupied property, we're going to address that in a little bit. You're going to be adding the TOPA form, which I believe is going to take the place of the TIP form. All right. Dealing with seller occupied or vacant units. All right. So close of escrow, if you want to extend the amount of time that the seller can stay in the property. Now, the most common is what? COE plus 3 days after close. And why do we do that? Well, particularly for some of our older sellers, by older, I mean in their 80s, writing an offer, giving them an extra day or two to get out, makes it a lot easier to get acceptance. And actually, you can probably get a lower price because at that age, I hate to say it, it's not about the money anymore. They're not going to have time to spend it. What it's about is convenience. Those sellers don't want to be stressed. So giving them a day or two, that could help the deal. Just remember, buyer needs to contact their insurance company and make sure their insurance company is good about the seller staying in the property a little bit longer, because technically it's a landlord-tenant situation. You know, that brings up another issue, and I want to go back to the previous screen. With these contingencies, I get a lot of questions sometimes from people regarding the loan contingency, and they're confusing it with the appraisal contingency. The loan contingency has to do with whether or not the buyer qualifies for the loan. Has nothing to do with the appraisal. Has nothing to do with the appraised value. The appraisal contingency has nothing to do with the buyer's credit or the buyer's income. It only has to do with what is this property worth. And that investigation contingency, L3, if the buyer can't get the property and can't get the loan because the seller had too many insurance claims and the buyer can't get property insurance, that's not a loan contingency. That's an investigation contingency. These contingencies are strictly interpreted. So please, when you're releasing contingencies, when you're talking about contingencies, attribute the contingencies to where they are. I know most of the time you say, well, they can't get the loan, can't get the appraisal, whatever, and you blend them together. 90% of the time, you're probably not going to get in trouble. But there are 10% of the cases where if you confuse them, your buyer could be in jeopardy. So just a warning on that, okay? All right, so now we got through seller occupied, okay, or in seller occupied. Remember, if the seller's going to be in there for 29 days or fewer, I'm in column 4, then you will use the SIP, seller in possession addendum or document, okay, to lay out the terms of the rules of occupancy for that seller once the buyer becomes the owner of the property. If the seller is going to be in the property for 30 days or more, then you're going to use the RLAS form, residential lease after sale. Both are landlord-tenant situations, but if the seller is going to be in the property longer than 30 days, it's a real landlord-tenant situation. You probably should be addressing rent and security deposits, right? Because that comes into play at that point. So again, make sure you run this by the lender. The lender may squawk. Make sure you run this by the buyer's insurance company, because property insurance may have a problem there. Okay, so down to D, documents, fees, and compliance. So the seller will deliver all documents within 7 days after acceptance, just as we do today. When the parties receive escrow instructions, they will sign those and get them back to escrow within 5 days, just as we have now. Seller will make requests for HOA documents within 3 days, just as we have now. Okay, so N1, 2, and 3, there is no change. If any of you are saying, oh, wait a minute, is that new? See, it got buried in the current contract and you didn't see it. So don't say that, particularly if your manager's nearby, because they're going to know you didn't read the contract, okay? Going down to the last one, N4, a little bit of a change here. Because smoke alarms CO detectors and water heater bracing is required. This is not a point of sale requirement. It is required in all homes. And if one of your homes does not have those, that's a $100 fine if the government ever finds out. Of course, they never would, but it is. So seller needs to install those items within 7 days if they're not already present. Now, who's going to pay for that is in a later paragraph. But the property must have smoke alarm, CO detector, and carbon heater or water heater bracing within 7 days after acceptance if it's not already there. The one exception to CO detectors, if you have an all-electric home with no fireplace and no attached garage. You see, if all of your appliances, including the furnace and the water heater, are electric, if you don't have a fireplace and you don't have an attached garage, nothing's burning. At least nothing's supposed to be burning, right? Okay, but any of the other items, gas furnace, fireplace, gas stove, gas oven, car in the attached garage, that can all generate carbon monoxide. All right, so that's why I have it. Of course, O is left blank, so paragraph 3O doesn't get confused with paragraph 30. Okay, so we go to M2, far right-hand side, SIP, seller in possession, if 29 days or less, RLAS, 30 days or more. Do I really need to do the SIP if it's only 1 or 2 days? Yes, Lisa will haunt you if you don't do that, okay? It's really important, okay? It's really important. I run into agents that kind of are real loose with that stuff and they get into trouble. I just got to chuckle to myself. Okay. All right. Also the QA. Sometimes a buyer's inspection on the property is not scheduled until after 7 days. How do you verify that smoke detectors and carbon monoxide bracing are done correctly? Do sellers need to provide proof of it? You can pick it up in your inspection, okay? A buyer can pick it up in their final walkthrough. It's just, we're telling the seller, look, you've got 7 days to do this. There's later language. Typically, the appraiser is not going to be out there for the first 7 days, right? Give me that. Okay. If the appraiser goes out there on day 9 or 10, and of course, the appraiser is looking for those 3 items. If they're not there, the appraiser checks that on the box, and it's going to require the appraiser to go revisit. And there's a fee for that. The contract says the seller will be liable for that fee because they were supposed to have those things installed within the first 7 days. They did not. So they are responsible for that appraiser having to come back, and the seller is going to have to foot the bill for that revisit. Okay. So I guess that's the stick. No carrot this time. That's the stick. All right. So now let's go into page 3. And our first paragraph there under P is items included and excluded. Okay, so we have our nice exhaustive list. The one thing is required, bathroom mirrors, unless excluded below. I guess there's a lot of sellers that like to remove their bathroom mirrors. But anyway, bathroom mirrors are staying. I guess your other mirrors can be removed, but bathroom mirrors are staying. New change, third column there, last item, wall mounted brackets for video or audio equipment. Okay, so they are not included. That means the seller can remove the bracket that the TV is mounted to the wall. In the current agreement, the bracket stays unless the box is checked, then the bracket can be removed. In this contract, the bracket is not included unless you check the box, then the bracket is included. And you'll find in later language, if the bracket is removed by the seller, they have to patch, but they don't have to repaint, just like we have in the current contract. All right. So if you want to add any additional items to include, you can in P1, and then P2, excluded items. And we'll get into more detail on all of this, plus the issue of stuff in the cloud to operate your smartphone. That's all included now. Now, your phone still belongs to you, okay? You still get to keep your phone. But the software up in the cloud that makes the lights in your house turn on and the oven operate and the cameras on and that sort of stuff, that technology is being transferred to the buyer along with the means to operate that technology, okay? It's the same concept of the seller has to provide keys to the house to the buyer. The seller has to provide the tech, the passwords, the access to operate the house to the buyer, okay? So just to FYI on that. All right, so here's our allocation of costs. So there's how we can address inspection fees, reports, and that sort of thing. So our first item there, Q1, NHD, who's going to pay for it? And any specificity of these items. Now, where it says who pays, it can be buyer, seller, or both. And in the gray section there, it says if it's both, it's going to be split equally. So that's how we're going to do it. Now, my recommendation is not to check buyer for any of these, except for perhaps sharing the cost of escrow, okay? The reason I don't like to check buyer is because the seller could care less if the buyer's going to pay for something or not, more than likely, right? But if the buyer then doesn't want to pay for something, who cares? The lender might care. Lenders sometimes will pick up buyer pays and add them to a loan condition. And now the buyer has to pay for it because they can't get the loan if they don't. So as a general rule, the only box I'm checking is seller, okay? We have a new box for escrow. We'll get to it in a second, all right? So if you want to add any additional inspection reports, got an earlier question regarding sewer. I brought up termite, perhaps roof. Q2, Q3, you can add that report. Who's going to pay for it, all right? Who's going to pay for smoke alarms, CO detectors, water heater bracing? Buyer, seller, or both? I'm assuming most of us will be checking seller because the house is supposed to have those when we write our offers. But again, those are negotiable items. Same thing with government required point of sale inspections, any government required corrective remedial actions. The big one there on inspections, if you're in a city where they do require a point of sale inspection, of course, they're going to be looking for water heater, smoke, and carbon monoxide. The other one is low flow water appliances, showers, faucets, things of that nature. If the property was built since 1994, they should be compliant unless the seller changed it, right? If the property was built prior to 1994, water conservation devices were not required, so it might be an issue. So if you got a house older than 1994 or built prior to 1994, that could be a bigger issue. Since 1994, hopefully lesser of an issue, all right? But you never know, you know? Sellers can change things around in their house. They could add conservation fixtures, they can remove them. They want more water pressure in their shower to get the conditioner out of their hair, right? I don't have that problem. All right, so escrow fees. Something kind of weird here. Buyer, seller, or both. But then they have another one, each to pay their own. What does that mean? Well, remember above it says, if you check both, it's equal. Well, they're not really equal because in addition to the sale escrow, we have a loan escrow. So you have the sale escrow between the buyer and the seller, but you also have a loan escrow between the borrower, who's also the buyer, and the lender. Well, the buyer is going to be responsible for the loan escrow as the borrower. So the common way to resolve that has typically been each to pay their own. But I have a feeling that this was an item of discussion at the Standard Forms Committee at CAR. So they decided to split the baby in the Solomon fashion and create a new little category, each to pay their own. And then your escrow holder on the right there, so you can put autumn sky, right? And then below that, we have owner's title insurance policy. Typically, sellers pays for that. The default is whoever handled the escrow. But if you want to have something different than having an escrow, say you want to put in fidelity title, okay, you can put that in there. Could you also fit Dan Tran's name in there? Well, I think you would, because then the TOP form would pop up, right? Okay. Let's see, buyer's lender title policy. There's no box for that because that's a buyer pay, right? Likewise, when we get down to homeowner association fee for preparing disclosures, that's typically a seller pay because seller's required to provide those documents under state law. And then the HO certification fee. This is usually something required by the lender to make sure the property is in compliance. You know, sometimes lenders want to make sure, like in a condo complex, you've got a certain percentage of owner occupants. They may bring up an issue regarding a reserve study or the amount of reserves. But since this is a lender requirement of the buyer, it's put in as a buyer pay, right? HOA transfer fees are negotiable. Private transfer fees are negotiable. And then Q16, Q17, any other fees, negotiable there. And if you're going to have a home warranty plan, could negotiate that. Again, if you've got an older property, you may want to ask seller to pay for an HOA or a home warranty plan. Newer properties, maybe not so much. If seller is not going to pay for one, you're not going to ask seller to pay for it. I recommend checking the box at the bottom. Buyer waives it. Buyer can always come back and buy one during escrow. But again, I don't want to see buyer agreeing to pay for a home warranty plan and then have it show up as a loan condition if buyer runs short of funds in escrow, right? And then R, other terms, right? Other terms. So all of our addenda, okay? All of our advisories, okay? All the extra stuff, all here in 4A, B, and C. So CAR is moving away from specialty purchase agreements if they can. So there's not going to be a probate purchase agreement anymore. There's not going to be a manufactured home purchase agreement or mobile home purchase agreement anymore. Since most of that agreement is exactly the same as this agreement, they're just going to have an addendum to pick up the extra stuff. Now, if you've got a tenant in the property, okay, we need to address that in the TOPA. Okay, so this is going to be a new form, and there's some challenges to it. We'll address it a little bit later, but currently in the current contract, the tenant needs to be out 5 days prior to close of escrow. Right? It is seller's responsibility to get the tenant out, which means the buyer could sue the tenant. Excuse me, the buyer could sue the seller if the tenant is not out of the property 5 days prior to escrow, because that's a covenant. CAR is changing that. CAR has taken the position that it sometimes is very difficult to get a tenant out of a property. Therefore, under this new TOPA form, if you have a tenant in the property, the tenant will remain unless you check the box. And if you check the box in the first paragraph, or is it the second paragraph? It's the second part of the first paragraph. It's 1B of the first paragraph of the TOPA, all right? If you check that box, then the tenant must be out 5 days prior to close. Why 5 days? Well, that's when the buyer can do their final walkthrough or verification of condition. What if the tenant's not out? And what if the seller's not able to remove the tenant? What happens? Buyer has a choice. Buyer can either buy the property with the tenant and inherit all of the drama that that new tenant will give them, okay, which might be difficult if the buyer intends to occupy that property as their personal residence, because the lender's not going to be keen on that at all. Or the buyer can cancel. If the buyer cancels, they get their deposit back, okay, even if they initially liquidated damages clause. They get their appraisal fee back. They get their inspection fees back, but they waive all other rights that they may have against the seller. So basically, they get their out-of-pocket expenses in escrow back. They get their deposit back, but they can't sue the seller for breach of failing to get the tenant out. You know, I guess CAR had to come on one side or the other on this issue. If I was there, I would have gone the other way. I would have said, no, buyer has the right to go after the seller because seller's not in performance. All right. But CIR went to the other. Okay. So that is the way it's going to be. Can you change it? No, you cannot. I mean, if you hire an attorney, they can create a separate addendum to override what the TOPA says, but you cannot, because that would be the unlicensed practice of law. Okay. Let me tell you, this TOPA is written pretty tight. Okay. You've got choice A, buyer take the tenant, or choice B, buyer walk away, get their out-of-pocket expenses, and waive all rights against the seller. Okay. So that's the TOPA. The next two are going to be new agreements. Now, what is a tenant in common purchase agreement addendum, or a TIC-PA? So in certain areas of California, the demand for housing is so great, okay, is so great that people are buying fourplexes. 4 people are buying a fourplex together, and each one gets to live in one of the units. That's not a subdivision. That's one property with 4 owners as tenant in common with one deed, right? Strange legal animal. I don't know how to deal with it, but they're working on it. Second item, stock cooperative purchase agreement addendum. Okay, we know a condo is a subdivision, and we know that a planned development is a subdivision, but a stock cooperative is not. One deed owned by a corporation, you own a share of stock that lets you live in one of the apartments or units. So CAR is wrestling with this with DRE. Actually, not really wrestling. They're trying to work something out, because DRE is going to view both of these from the perspective of a developer subdivision, even though it is not a legal subdivision of property. It is a work in progress. Thankfully, our housing market here hasn't gotten so crazy to see ticks, but they might. And we may see ticks with auxiliary dwelling units, ADUs. So we don't know, but anyway, that's coming at us. Other addenda there listed. Got the buyer intent, seller intent to exchange, court confirmation, short sale addendum. Hopefully we don't see those for a while. Backup offer, CIR addendum form. Your septic, well, property monument, propane addendum is listed there. Okay, so you can attach that. And then C, our other addendums, including the wildfire disaster advisory. I love the wildfire disaster advisory. That is a user-friendly form. If you're selling properties that's near a fire hazard, but the property is not listed in the NHD as a very high or severe fire zone. Okay, I think that fire hardening defensible space addendum, first of all, it's a tough form to get through. If your broker requires it, you use it. But I think it's a lot easier to use the wildfire disaster advisory if you're not in one of those fire zones. But if you're in one of those fire zones and the seller has to provide a TDS and the property was built since 2010, then you have to give that fire hardening defensible space disclosure. There's no way around it. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay. But I'm kind of a big fan of not giving a complicated form if you don't have to. The only other form here I want to talk about is on the right-hand side, third from the bottom, that statewide buyer-seller advisory, that SBSA. It's that monster 14-page form. CAR has done a really good job of changing the table of contents in page 2. It now is a table of contents that does an alphabetical listing of all the items, but it also has a grouping by category. So they really did a good job of cleaning that table of contents. You can actually now find stuff in there. And there's stuff in there people didn't even know, like, let's say, mediation. What's an arbitration? Okay, what are liquidated damages? So you don't have to explain these items to your seller or buyer. It's in the SBSA. You can just give that document to them and say, hey, look, you read it. I can't advise you as to legal items. All right, moving on. Okay, so paragraph 5. Now we get into the regular meat of the contract. And as we get into the meat, look in paragraph 5A1, initial deposit, and it's going to refer in that second line to paragraph 3D1. So supposedly, if you hover over those letter numbers 3D1, a little pop-up box is going to come up showing you paragraph 3D1. And if you click on that, it'll take you back to paragraph 3D1. Okay. One of those features should be available, maybe both of those features in December. The feature that's not available, if it's not available, will be coming shortly, presumably in January. All right. We've got the clarification of retention of deposit as well as increase of deposit. Remember, currently, if you give an increase of deposit, you're supposed to give that RID, receipt of deposit form. Of course, you're probably nowhere around when that increase of deposit comes in. So it's really not a receipt of deposit. It's a delivery of deposit. So the form's been changed. It's now known as the DID instead of the RID for delivery of deposit. So no more RID. Come December, we will have the DID. And then with retention of deposit. Okay, so in contracts, we can provide for liquidated damages clauses because in contract law, you cannot sue for speculative damages, right? In tort law, somebody rear ends you in the car, you sue them for your pain and suffering. That's speculative, but you're allowed that in tort law, not in contract law. You know, the seller says, well, I could have sold the property to somebody else, but you canceled. Well, who? Well, I don't know. That's speculative. So under contract law, we have liquidated damage clause. So the seller knows what they're entitled to if that buyer breaches the agreement and the liquidated damage clause is included. So what is the buyer breach? Failure to perform after releasing contingencies, okay? So the buyer does not perform after releasing their contingencies, then the deposit can become liquidated damages if the liquidated damages was initial. The liquidated damage clause was initial. That's not the same as saying a non-refundable deposit. But I know a lot of agents out there write the words non-refundable deposit, which brings me to my little quote. The only thing worse than the unlicensed practice of law is the unlicensed practice of the wrong law, which is exactly what you're going to have if you write non-refundable deposit. Okay, so please don't ever write non-refundable deposit. Case law, statutory law does not allow a non-refundable deposit, particularly in a residential transaction. Okay, and typically California law says all deposits are refundable anyway, in any deal. Okay, all right. So B, if you got an all cash offer, this we're afraid of that. All the information we need about loans, the first loan, additional financing, buyer's loan status, FHA, VA, are explained here in C. Buyer's loan status, we got some new language in here. the seller's agent, the seller, are now allowed to contact the buyer's lender to find out how the loan is doing. Now, do they get to see the credit score? No. Do they get to see their income or their tax returns? No. But they can call for an update, and they are entitled to a report from the buyer's lender as to the status of the loan. Okay, so that's something that's new, and I think everyone's going to be happy about that. D, balance of debt, purchase price or down payment. Okay, and then E, limits on credits to buyers. Okay, so we all know the sweet spot for a loan is what? 20%, right? That's what lenders like. If you're less than 20% down, you're going to have a guarantee or insurance or something. Well, let's say you've got a buyer with 20% down. And let's say the seller is giving a credit for closing costs, but that credit exceeds the actual amount needed for those costs. So presumably it's going to the buyer. Well, if the buyer is pocketing that excess credit, then their 20% down really isn't 20% down. It's like 19.85% down or something, right? And that's going to trigger a problem with the loan. So if you have that situation of a seller excessive credit, it will be refunded back to the seller to keep the buyer at 20% down. The purchase price will not be affected. Okay. And again, if you get too much pushback from a seller or a buyer, or like, this is a lender thing, right? This is really more of a disclosure and verbiage to say how it's going to be worked out if the lender raises the flag for an excessive credit. All right. Okay, getting ready for a break. So just hang on with me now. Additional financing terms. Okay. So verification of down payment and closing costs explained. Verification of loan applications explained. Right. And now we get into page 5, buyer state financing. So there have been problems with buyers stating they're going to get a conventional loan, or using the default language here to get a conventional loan, and then they try to switch over to a government loan, an FHA or VA. I think that is a material misrepresentation, and that can expose the buyer and the agent to liability. So I don't recommend doing that. I've had people come back to me and says, well, that's the only way they can get their offer accepted. If the only way you can get your offer accepted is to misrepresent what you're doing, that sounds like an actual or a cause of action. So you don't want to do that. The buyer needs to represent truthfully the offer they're presenting to the seller. Okay, we'll talk more about this good faith when we get into release of contingencies and the purpose of contingencies as well. Paragraph 7, further explanation of occupancy and conditions of closing. Remember, the seller is selling the property in its present or as is condition, which means the seller's not agreeing to make any repairs unless they do so in escrow with a request for repairs, or they accept an offer that has been modified to include certain repairs they want the seller to do. But that does not negate the seller's obligation to disclose all material facts, anything that could possibly affect the value of the property. Does the seller have to disclose an earlier appraisal on the property that they may have in their possession? No, they don't. An appraisal does not affect the value of the property. An appraisal, okay, estimates the value of the property. But whether property A has an appraisal or property A does not have an appraisal on it from an earlier escrow that didn't go through, that has no bearing on what that property is worth. It has no bearing as to whether there are any material facts or red flags on that property. All right. However, if an earlier appraisal did note material facts, then it would be incumbent on the seller, required of the seller, to disclose those material facts, but not produce a copy of that appraisal. All right. So if seller is going to remain in possession after close of escrow, paragraph C addresses that. Paragraph D states that seller is going to assign all assignable rights on the property, keys, access to home automation systems, internet connecting devices. Again, that's that stuff in the cloud, right? So you need to be able to operate your smartphone, or excuse me, not smartphone, need to operate your smart home. Well, you need the passwords to get in there to operate the smart home. Okay, so again, that is now going to be considered as real property. Now, remember when we were talking about in paragraph 3L, all the contingencies, and they were laid out in that order of loan, appraisal, investigation, review of seller documents, title. Look here in paragraph 8, A through E. It's in the same order, all right? It's in the same order. So both the loan and the appraisal can be released. Those contingencies can be released with this contract, but the next 5 items, which starts with investigation of property, review of seller documents, and title, they have to be removed if you're going to remove them with the offer, with the contract or the contingency removal form. All right. But the nice thing I like about this form is they reformatted everything, and everything is in a orderly process as you go through the contract. So I think it's going to be much easier to find items in the remaining 13 pages, even though unfortunately most people are only going to read the first 3 pages. Okay, so let's go into page 6. And again, we're continuing with those contingencies of the buyer, those 8 contingencies: condominium, buyer review of leased liened items, and then goes to removal or waiver of contingencies. And here we have more clarification that you can remove contingencies such as review of documents in the contract, like appraisal, investigation, but if it's a statutorily mandated disclosure, like the transfer disclosure statement, you cannot remove that rescission right that you have under the statute upon receipt of that TDS, NHD, lead-based paint, that sort of thing. All right. All right. So removal or cancellation, again, clarified here. Again, buyer shall have the time specified, 17 days or 5 days after receipt, okay, to cancel. Sale of buyer's property, again, we're going to be attaching that COP form, which has been updated. So if you haven't seen it lately, it may be different since the last time you saw it. Moving in now to paragraph 9, items included or excluded from the sale. So again, at the top, there is verbiage that says things included, excluded in the MLS are not included or excluded unless mentioned in the contract. That's basic contract law because the MLS is not part of the contract. But I will warn you, if you have a listing and you put in the MLS that the refrigerator, the washer, dryer are included, and if that's omitted from the contract, and now the buyer comes after you saying, where's my refrigerator, washer, dryer? Most small claims judges will say, wait a minute, you made a representation in the MLS that this buyer is going to get the washer, dryer, and refrigerator. You're buying them a washer, dryer, and refrigerator. And they may make that finding against both agents and the seller, because California is a joint and several liability state, which means you may only be 1/3 liable, but you can be 100% responsible. All right. So very important that things to be included or excluded must be addressed back in paragraph 3P. Okay. And we know it's 3P because we see here in 9B references to 3P. Okay. In the contract, which makes it real easy to navigate through. All right. We also have more information, more clarification regarding security systems, home automation, non-dedicated devices. So again, those smart houses, you need to transfer the technology so it doesn't get transferred as a dumb house, right? It needs to be a smart house. And then a C at the bottom, again, those items excluded from sale. Note that there has been a note, or excuse me, there has been a change in those brackets that mount the TV to the wall. But the one thing that has not changed is if the bracket is agreed to be removed, holes still get patched, don't have to repaint. Now we go to page 7, right? Paragraph 10. So allocation of costs, okay? That is all done mostly in 3Q, okay? For inspection reports and certificates, we have 3 and 4 for government required and corrective remedial actions. Again, this gives greater clarification to what has already been negotiated and agreed upon by the buyer and seller, but gives it in a narrative sense, so there's no question as to what is or what is not meant in paragraph 3. And that's the key. While we all pretty much understand what paragraph 3 means just by the checking of the boxes in that grid, this gives further clarification to it. So if you do have a question, okay, about paragraph 3, my recommendation is go to the corresponding paragraph later in the agreement and read that material, okay? Because this is where you actually have the contractual language that the court will look at as to what is meant by the checking of boxes in paragraph 3. They're under 10B3. Remember I talked about reinspection fees because the seller didn't install the smoke alarm, CO2 detector, bracing the water heater. Again, seller's going to be responsible for any reinspection fees because they didn't get it installed in time, right? Home warranty, okay? Explanation of what home warranty is. We'll go over, I'm going to move on past that in the interest of time. And then our statutory rights. So again, further clarification that if you have a mandatory disclosure, TDS, NHD, metal roofs, improvement bonds, high fire severity areas, you're going to provide the appropriate form, the TDS, SPQ, FHDS, all specified here. You cannot waive those mandatory disclosures, okay? And that would give you cancellation rights. Now, real quick, your TCs all know this. The SPQ must be given per this contract if the seller's giving a TDS. So if the seller has to give a transfer disclosure statement, then they're also required under this contract to give a seller property questionnaire. If the seller's exempt from a TDS, those are lenders selling their REO, real estate owned properties, they cut back through foreclosure, probate, bankruptcy, for that matter, any court ordered sale or court supervised sale, which would include conservatorships and guardianships. They don't give an SPQ, this contract gives an ESD, okay, the exempt seller disclosure. However, you may have a situation with a lender, they won't give that either. So if you have a listing, and let's say it's an REO or a bankruptcy or a probate, you need to contact your seller and say, hey, offer that comes in, we'll be asking you to complete an ESD, exempt seller disclosure. Are you comfortable doing that? And if they come back with you and say, no, we will not, then when this offer comes in, you need to revisit that issue with your seller and make sure it's countered out. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to be in escrow and have the contract say seller must give an ESD, and your lender seller say, nuts to you, I'm not going to do it. This could also come up with an investor seller. Now, a person who bought a home, has rented it out, they may think they're TDS exempt, but they are not. Can they counter out a seller property questionnaire? Yes, they can, if they want to. But again, it has to be the seller's decision. And there's nothing wrong with you presenting that to the seller, but let them make the decision. Could a homeowner who's lived in the property for 30 years counter out the SPQ, even though they have to give a transfer disclosure statement? Well, yeah, they could. I don't recommend that because that seller actually has important knowledge about that property, which will be disclosed in the SPQ. And I think it's very important to include that in the transaction. Okay, so I'm a big fan of the SPQ. I'm not a big fan of going into escrow and having my seller go into a meltdown because now they don't want to give disclosures. Okay, so just FYI on that. All right, lead-based paint disclosure. Again, that's going to affect properties that are or have been built prior to 1978. What about a property that was built in 1979 with old paint? You don't have to worry about it. First of all, any properties built in the 1970s probably don't have lead-based paint in California because lead was basically removed from paint in California in the 60s along with DDT, all right? But federal law says if a property was built before 78, you must give the lead-based paint disclosure. Easy peasy. Built before 78 gets lead-based paint. Built after 78 or in 78 or later, no disclosure, because that's what the law says. Don't have to get involved with it, all right? Just follow the law. New form though, or new lettering of form. The lead-based paint disclosure is now the LPD. It was or it is currently the FLD, I think, which looks like flood. So I guess a lot of people thought it was a flood form. No, it was lead-based paint. So they changed it to LPD for lead-based paint. Well, I guess it's lead paint disclosure now. Lead paint disclosure for LPD, all right? So moving on now to page 8. So home fire hardening disclosure and advisory. So 3 things we need to trigger the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory. Number 1, the property is listed in the NHD report as being in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. So you need to get that NHD report early. My recommendation, within 3 days, okay? It usually gets a 24-hour turnaround. Get that NHD report early and ask for your local mapping, okay? Because you want a complete report. The law actually provides cover for you. If you make a good faith effort in getting or recommending the seller order an NHD report, which I like the one with local mapping, about 110, 125 bucks, that one, right? Then you are basically free of any liability if that report is an error, because we really don't have any way to look at those maps anyway, right? We don't have access to them. Okay, so if the property is in that hazard zone, that fire hazard zone, and the property was constructed before 2010, okay, and the seller has to give a TDS. So those are the 3: TDS, NHD fire zone, built before 2010. Then this home fire hardening disclosure advisory must be given. If those are not the case, this form does not have to be given under the law. Now, your broker may ask you to do the form, okay, but it doesn't have to be given under the law. My preference is, since this form is trying to trick you to get around and it starts asking about local authority inspections, and a lot of our local authorities don't do inspections because they haven't caught up with the law yet, I kind of like that wildfire advisory form. It just seems to do the same job, and it's a lot simpler. But I will defer to your broker. Whatever your broker tells you to do, that's what you have to do. Okay, nothing I can say. I'm kind of like you. I cannot change the policies of your broker. All right. Okay. Again, E cannot waive any statutory disclosures. I guess I want to make that very clear with these non-contingent offers. All right. And then termination rights. If you get a statutory disclosure, personally, you have 3 days to terminate. By mail, 5 days to terminate. It's not a contingency. It's a right of cancellation. Okay, so those are how those are working. Moving on. Withholding taxes. Okay, dealing with withholding taxes. So now, if you have withholding, all right, well, CAR has made it a little bit simpler. The default language says that the buyer will withhold for FERPTA 15%, for Cal FERPTA 3 1/3%. If you want to avoid that, then you have to produce the AS form, which all you know as the FERPTA form, and give that to the buyer. Okay, that's what the paragraph says. However, if you're escrow, or in your case with Autumn Sky, Fidelity is going to take the place of, they can accept the role of a qualified substitute, which means the seller can give their AS form to Fidelity, who will agree to take or become the qualified substitute. Fidelity will then issue a qualified substitute form. There is a QS form in ZIP forms, but most of your title company escrows, they have their own forms. You can use their own forms. That lets the seller and the buyer know that they've accepted the responsibility of the qualified substitute. Don't have to worry about the withholding. Don't have to worry about seller releasing their social security number or tax ID number to the buyer. Right? So in transactions, we're required to disclose the website for the Megan's Law database and for gas hazardous liquid transmission pipelines. Since that disclosure or that notification is required in all transactions, it's put right here into the contract, so we don't have to have a separate disclosure form for that. If the property is in a condominium or planned development, that has to be disclosed by the seller to the buyer within 7 days. Likewise, any natural or environmental hazards, okay, typically done with the NHD report. Your earthquake disclosure forms needs to be done. And then also any known material facts need to be disclosed. And that brings us to paragraph 9, or should be page 9, paragraph 12. And here is the buyer's responsibility to inspect the property. So buyer bears a responsibility to inspect the property. And this clarifies what the buyer's rights are, what the buyer's obligations are. So the buyer cannot just buy a property sight unseen. They have a responsibility to investigate. And if they fail to do so, they do so upon their own risk. Buyer does agree to indemnify the seller if the buyer's inspections, investigations by them or any of their contractors or agents cause damage to the property. And that's found in paragraph 12E. All right. Title investing, of course, it's buyer's responsibility to inform escrow how they're going to take title. You do not want to advise them on taking title. You don't even want to tell them how you hold title to your property. Okay. Now, if you want to call Dan over at Fidelity Title, they have that cool little card sheet that shows the various ways of holding title: tenants in common, joint tenancy, community property rather survivorship. And you want to give that to your buyer, that's great. The buyer doesn't like the way they took title, they can sue Fidelity, right? Can't sue you. You're just the conveyor of information. You're not the source of the information, okay? So anyway, contact Dan Tran. He can give you all that good title stuff. Let them take responsibility for it, all right? Okay, the famous paragraph 14, which is now etched in the marble at CIR down on Virgil Street. Paragraph 14 will never change its location. It's always going to be time periods, removal contingency, and cancellation rights. And for the most part, paragraph 14 has not changed at all. Okay. Seller has 7 days to disclose all documents, all disclosures, give everything to the buyer. Okay. Now, it doesn't actually say 7 days here in paragraph 14A because it's back in paragraph 3N, right? Likewise, buyer will have 17 days from acceptance or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later, to cancel based on what they've received. All right. So those timeframes haven't changed, right? Except for the numbers or the actual times or periods are specified in paragraph 3. Here just gives meaning to those words. So same thing goes if buyer doesn't release their contingencies in the time provided, 17 days or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later, seller can give a notice to perform. It is a 2-day notice to perform, and seller can give it 2 days early. So presumably on the 15th day, right? Once the seller gives that notice, they do not have to cancel, but they cannot cancel unless they first give the notice. Okay, so that's important. Seller wants to cancel. Have you given the notice to perform? No. Give the notice to perform. Do I have to? Yes, you do. Well, I'm worried if I give the notice, do I have to cancel? No. So seller doesn't have to cancel if they give the notice, but they can't cancel unless they give the notice first. And it's a 2-day notice, all right? Remember, today is day 0. Tomorrow is always day 1. Okay, we'll get into days a little bit more in the definitions, but today is always day 0. Count 1, count 2, and by the end of that count 2, then it triggers. All right, we'll talk about that more when we get into days. They've changed the days on definitions a little bit. All right. Now, there's another provision here that always gets confusing, and this has to do with the demand to close escrow. And unfortunately, it is buried in paragraph 14, and people confuse it with the notice to perform, and they're different. So you have the contingencies. How do you deal with a buyer who doesn't release their contingencies? You give them a notice to perform. I always like to give the agent on the other side a heads up that it's coming over. For reasons unknown to me, they get their nose bent out of shape if they get a notice to perform, even though the buyer is supposed to release their contingencies without being asked. We know they don't unless you ask them, but I always let them know what's coming over. Okay, so you've resolved that. The buyer has released their contingencies, all right? Now you come to close of escrow, and the buyer hasn't brought in their money, and the loan hasn't funded, or whatever's going on, but something's not happening. And the seller says, well, the heck with this, I'm canceling. No, not too fast. Before the seller can cancel the escrow, at the close or the date of close of escrow, the seller has to give a demand to close escrow, and it's a 3-day notice. So if we're dealing with contingencies, it's the notice to perform. And after those 2 days, buyer doesn't release contingencies, seller can cancel. But separate and apart from that, we are now at the end of the transaction, and the buyer's not bringing in their funds, or the buyer's not doing whatever they're supposed to do to close, or they're not dealing with their paperwork or whatever. And the seller says, let's cancel. Got to give that 3-day demand to close escrow. Okay. The thinking there is giving the buyer one last shot, 3 more days to get their act together. Okay. So effective cancellation deposits. Deposits are refundable to the buyer. Okay, unless the liquidated damages clause is initial. If a party makes a bad faith effort to keep the deposit or doesn't agree to release the deposit, okay, and has no good faith claim of doing so, they are liable for up to $1,000 civil penalty. Okay, so that's kind of a stick to get the seller to release the deposit if the buyer is canceling because of their contingency. Now, we remember our investigations, right? Or our contingencies, loans, appraisal, investigation, title documents, lease liened items, HOA, all that stuff. The buyer's reason to cancel, although they don't have to give a reason to cancel, but the reason to cancel needs to be based on it. Okay? A buyer just decides they don't like the orientation of the house. Buyer just decides they don't like the species of lawn that's in the yard or whatever. If that's really why the buyer doesn't want to buy the property, buyer can cancel. It doesn't have to be a good reason. It just means that they don't like the property. Okay. But if the buyer's reason for canceling is because they're also an escrow on another house, they only intend to buy one house, and that other house is the house they want to buy, that's not a good reason. That would be viewed as bad faith. Okay. So buyer's reason to cancel based on their contingencies needs to be based on good faith. While they don't have to give a reason, still needs to be based on good faith. Okay, so again, keep that in mind. You don't want to put your buyer, don't say, oh, buyer, you can cancel for any reason. Let's just put it in escrow. No. It needs to be based on the desirability of that house to buy. All right. All right, so paragraph 15, if the seller agrees to do any repairs, okay, they will do so in a workmanlike manner and provide copies of all paid receipts or invoices. Remember, during those 17 days, if buyer finds something wrong with the property, they can give a request for repairs to the seller. Seller doesn't have to respond. Seller can respond with agreeing to do it. Do some of them, not all of them, or agree to give money and not do them. Okay. I love sellers giving money and not doing the repairs for things like roof repairs, because how do you know if the roof has actually been repaired until the next rain, right? So I like money there, but if it's something so simple as repairing a hole in the wall or a broken window, that's pretty easy to verify that it was done properly. Okay, but those are repairs. Okay, so final verification of condition, paragraph 16. Again, this is the buyer's walkthrough. I think we've already exhausted that. Paragraph 17, proration. So for our newer agents, what's a proration? Well, a proration is an allocation of money, either income or expenses, based on the date of ownership. So the easiest way to explain prorations is if we're closing escrow on the 15th of the month of an apartment building, it's safe to say that the seller's probably collected all the rents. But since the buyer is going to own the apartment building for the second half of the month, the buyer's entitled to half of those rents. So escrow is just going to reduce the amount of money that the buyer needs to pay the seller for the property based on a half a month's rent, right? So rents, property taxes, that's probably the big one. Insurance, because buyers can take over a seller's insurance policy. Interest, if the buyer's going to take over a seller's loan, like an FHA or VA, because those loans are assumable, right? Those are usually prorated. Escrow deals with that. We don't have to, but we just have the parties agree that those expenses will be prorated. Brokers and agents are not a party to the contract, but paragraph 18 refers to another agreement that deals with commission. Right? Remember, do not ever put your commission in this agreement. Okay? If you are dealing with a proper, let's say you have a list, you're representing a buyer and your commission on that the listing agent is offering you is too low and you want more money, you do that with the CBC form, Cooperating Broker Compensation Agreement. And you do that before you show the buyer the house, right? Unless you have your buyer under a buyer representation agreement, then that gives you a lot more freedom, right? But you need to keep any mention of your commission, negotiation of your commission, separate and apart from the agreement between the buyer and the seller, because if your commission becomes part of the deal, then you've put your self-interest in front of those of your fiduciary, and that's a violation of law and commissioner regs. So be very careful about that, all right? Paragraph 19, lets escrow know what paragraphs escrow needs to be concerned about in this contract, all right? So Autumn Sky is happy about that. Moving on, more detailed information about escrow, what they're going to do. Paragraph 20, selection of service providers. So we like Fidelity, we like Autumn Sky, we like Panorama Mortgage, we like Werner Termite, right? But who really decides on who uses those? The buyer and the seller, right? They ultimately decide who the service providers will be. We just provide recommendations, and we give good recommendations in good faith based on our experience with these companies. And of course, our buyers and sellers depend on our recommendation. Just remember, ultimately is the decision of the buyer or seller who they want to use, but we can certainly make recommendations, and you're encouraged to do so. Paragraph 21, we will report this sale, you will report this sale to the multiple listing service, okay? That's an absolute need to do it. It's actually part of your membership obligations in the MLS that you will report all sales. One thing I shouldn't have to say, but I do it, for you representing buyers, okay? After escrow closes, go back into the MLS maybe 2 or 3 days later, look it up, make sure you got credit as the buyer's agent. Unfortunately, there are some seller's agents in there who, when they enter the sale data, they put themselves on both sides. So they quote unquote get credit for 2 transactions rather than 1, I guess thinking that if they should ever leave that brokerage company they're with over there, when they go to another company, maybe they'll get a higher commission split because it looks like they've done more transactions than they actually have. No, you really want credit for your transactions in the MLS. So look that up. If you see that they didn't do it right, just call them up and say, hey, I noticed that when I looked in the sale information, I wasn't listed as representing the buyer. Would you mind going back in there and changing that for me? And they'll go, oh, did I make a mistake? Oh, yeah, you did. I caught you. But be nice with them because you're going to have more transactions with them. All right. So just FYI on that. Attorney's fees are provided to the prevailing or winning party. Okay. If the parties agree and go through mediation. So mediation is mandatory. And the carrot for that, if you fail to agree or you refuse to agree to mediate and you win your case, you're not entitled to your attorney's fees, okay? Then paragraph 23, assignment. I've already talked about this. Just open it up for more discussion when we get through the bottom of this form, or actually, I think when we get to paragraph 24. Again, the buyer must request an assignment within the first 17 days. Unless the assignment is to the buyer's alter ego, their living trust, their LLC, their corporation, which they are the sole owner. If they're going to give it to a third party, they need to make that request within 17 days. You might also disclose to the seller if they're getting any money for that assignment. Seller's refusal will not be unreasonably denied. Okay, so that's how the assignment works. Paragraph 24, fair housing, we will comply with all fair housing laws. And then we'll get into paragraph 25 in a second. So definitions and instructions. So again, acceptance is when the communication of the acceptance has been delivered. That's been changed. We're going to talk about that at the last page. We can now communicate to the agent via email, and that will constitute delivery. So it's a little different there. We'll get to that a little bit later. Agent is anybody, right? Licensee, sales, broker associate, broker. We're going to use the word agent generically, even though under the statute, the agent is the broker. But we're using a very lay definition of agent here. This is the agreement or any addenda added to the agreement. There are no agreements else out there. I think we all know what as is. We are transferring the property, or seller is transferring the property in its current condition, but seller still needs to disclose all material facts. And authorized agent is the representative of either the seller or the buyer. So now we get into some more complex definitions. Up in Northern California, there's a competing publisher of forms. And their forms look very similar to CAR forms. And CAR is saying, well, if you say CAR form, you could be referring to any form. Okay, so we're not going to make a big deal of CAR form has to be done by CAR. Of course, we don't have those down here, but again, up in the Bay Area, it's an issue. Counting days. Okay, so this gets a lot of questions. Counting days. Today is day 0. Tomorrow is day 1. So if I deliver something to you today, or we get an acceptance today, or close of escrow happens today, today is day 0. Okay, so tomorrow is day 1 for day 2, day 3, day 5, day 7, day 17. Okay, so those are all the deadlines pre-printed in the form. If the seller is staying in the property after escrow, if escrow closes today, tomorrow is day. So tomorrow is always day 1, and then you count your days. Now, the only time we use business days is the amount of time to get the deposit, either the initial deposit or the increase of deposit, to escrow. And the reason we use business days is escrow is not open on non-business days. So escrow to be open, banks need to be open, the county recorder's office needs to be open, the title company needs to be open, okay? So it's going to be Monday through Friday, not a recognized holiday, okay? So those are business days. Everything else we use is calendar days. So if the last day to perform, day 2, day 3, day 5, day 7, day 17, falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, we roll over to the next business day, because if you're in escrow with, say, a corporation as a buyer or a seller, they're probably not open on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday. Okay, so that's why that language is in play. We still count calendar days, right? So if today is Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, okay, we count through the weekend. It's just if the last day, the 7th day, the 17th day is a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, then we roll over to the next business day, okay? So that's how we count our days. Now, next question about giving notice. You see, that 7th day or that 17th day, that is the scheduled performance day. But if the scheduled performance day is Saturday, the allowable performance day will be Monday, right? Because we roll to the next business day. When do you give the 2-day notice to perform? You give it 2 days in front of the scheduled performance day. That makes it a whole lot easier. So it's 2 days before the 7th day or 2 days before the 17th day, even if that day falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday. Okay, you don't go from the allowable performance day. Hopefully I didn't make this more confusing than it already is, all right? Now for delivery. When we get to page 16, you're going to see a place for the agent and their alternate to put in their email address. You can now email your disclosures, your documents, your anything to that person. And as soon as you hit send, it has now been delivered. Well, what if they didn't open their email? Tough. You now have to open your email, okay? You need to open your email, all right? Real estate's a 24/7 business. You need to open your email, because if I hit send and that email doesn't bounce back and I can show in my sent column or my sent box that it went to the right email address, it's been delivered. All right. Now, what if you deliver everything with links and they don't like links or they can't open your links? They have 3 days to respond and say, your links stink. I don't like them. Send it to me as an attachment. So then you send them to an attachment. What if they don't like your attachments? Nah, they have to accept your attachments. Okay. So attachments have to go through. Links they can object to. Well, I guess if you saved it in a document that no one can open, if you the CIO hasn't dealt with that, but links you can object to within 3 days, but attachments you can't. You got to accept your attachments. So that's delivery. All right. So I think we're good here. Paragraph 26, very simple and easy. Terms, conditions of the offer. This is the entire contract. Okay. Everything is in here. Okay. Paragraph 27, time is of the essence. You cannot change this agreement unless done so in writing and signed by all parties. And then paragraph 28, we have a new signature page that will hopefully do away with that representative capacity form in most cases. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but this contract actually allows for you to put in the entity, print your name, sign your name, give your title, and once you do that, all you have to do is sign your name in future documents, okay? So it does away with the need of replicating your authority in future documents. We'll talk about that in a little bit. All right. So now we get to page 14. And the first thing that will stand out here in page 14 is the cleaning up of it all, okay? And I really like the way they did this. So we see that liquidated damages, paragraph 29, and paragraph 31 have boxes around them. The only way they can be included, both parties to initial. Warning, one party initials and the other party doesn't, you don't have a contract. What is this signed document I have? It's not valid. It's not valid because we don't know whether paragraph 21, paragraph 29, or paragraph 31 are included or excluded because one party wants it, one party presumably doesn't. It needs to be countered out, right? Now, the standard verbiage in paragraph 1 of the counteroffer says any paragraph that requires the signature of both parties and only has a signature of one party is deemed removed. So the counteroffer will save you. Okay, that's that pre-printed language at the very top that nobody ever reads, right? But if you don't have a counteroffer and one party initials and the other party doesn't, you don't have a contract, which is why back in the pre-DocuSign stage, when I would write an offer, and let's say my buyer included liquidated damages or arbitration, I would then take my yellow highlighter and highlight seller's initials in that paragraph. I had one agent said, you're trying to convince the seller to include that. And he says, I don't care if they include it or not. They either include it or they counter it out. I just don't want them to skip over it because then we won't have a valid contract. All right. Okay. So let's get into liquidated damages. Okay. As I mentioned before, if this paragraph is initialed by both parties, buyer defaults, which means cannot perform or will not perform after releasing all contingencies, then the seller's entitled to accept the deposit in lieu of suing the buyer for damages. The one caveat on there, if the buyer intends to occupy the property as their personal residence and that deposit is in excess of 3%, the most that the seller can keep would be that 3%. Okay, so that 3% is a cap. It's not how much the liquidated damages are. The liquidated damages are always the amount of the deposit. All right. Going down to mediation. Mediation is simply an opportunity for the two parties to sit down and try to settle. Now, the agent is not a party to mediation, although they can voluntarily go in if they want to, but they are not a party. Anybody can serve as the mediator because the mediator cannot make a binding decision. They can make recommendations, but they cannot compel a decision or make a ruling. So anybody can be a mediator. It can be a retired judge, an attorney, bartender, masseuse, priest, anybody they agree upon, whoever the parties agree, okay? That can be the mediator, right? But mediation is a mandatory part of the contract, okay? Mandatory. Arbitration needs to be initialed in because here the parties are actually agreeing to give up their right to trial and allow an arbitrator who needs to be either a retired judge or an attorney with at least 5 years of residential real estate law experience. Now, up in the mediation paragraph, we actually have a website that CAR maintains of mediators. I will say that as the amount in controversy increases, the greater the likelihood the mediator is going to be an attorney. Just simply, they're going to understand rules of evidence, strength of the case, that sort of thing. Arbitration has to be an attorney or a retired judge, all right? Don't have a website or recommendation of who the arbitrator is, although there's a blank that you can specify an arbitrator if you want to. You can put in there American Arbitration Association, JAMS, Judicial Arbitration Mediation Services, okay? So you can put one in there if you want to, otherwise, somebody who's mutually agreed upon, all right? CAR is talking about creating a little toggle dot where CAR will then list a series of mediation, or excuse me, arbitration companies if you want to elect in that. They're not there yet, but they might make a revision of the form within the next year or so, all right? Okay, moving on from arbitration. Again, if you have a buyer or seller who has questions about what is liquidated damages, what is mediation, what is arbitration, refer to them to that SBSA, Statewide Seller Buyer Advisory. They have really good paragraphs explaining those in there, all right? So now to page 15, paragraph 32, okay? Our offer. So this is the offer, okay? If you have an entity as the buyer, okay, you can specify that entity, okay? So if we go down to D, buyer signature, you'll have the signature line or the person signing, then the printed name of the entity, okay? The Mount Sac Corporation. And then the printed name of the legally authorized signer, Edwin Estes. And then the title, Professor, right? So if you are acting on behalf of an entity, you have to state the name of that entity. You have to state the name of that representative. You need to give the title of that representative and then signed by that representative. Now, as soon as you do this, for all later documents, disclosures, whatever, all I would have to do is sign my name. I don't have to sign my name, print my name as, well, print your name, yeah, but I don't have to put, you know, as Representative Mount Sac. No, it's all done here and it refers to future documents, okay? So that should make it a lot easier, all right? Okay, moving down, same thing for the seller, okay? So we don't need to do that representative capacity addendum, okay? We get away with it. The only reason we'd have to do the representative capacity addendum if we've got two entities, right? You've got the Mount Sac Corporation and you've got the Chafee Corporation, right? Okay, then we're gonna have to use the representative capacity because you have two entities. But as long as you just have one entity, which is commonly what? The buyer or seller's LLC or the buyer or seller's living trust, right? So that should make it a lot simpler there. Again, if the seller's going to counter, we got reference to the seller counter offer or the seller multiple counter offer, or if the seller's taking this as a backup offer, we can attach the backup offer addendum, right? So the buyer had originally signed above, seller's going to sign below, okay? If the offer is not accepted, well, the seller doesn't have to check or initial down here, at the very bottom of the screen. We certainly encourage them to do so, particularly if you're in a multiple offer situation, because there is concerns out there that agents may not present all offers to their seller. It's even greater concern is if you have more than one offers from the same company, right? If you're here at eHomes and somebody else at eHomes has written an offer, but somebody from Mount Sac Realty has written an offer, the agent from Mount Sac Realty is wondering, did you give preference to the eHomes agent because they're one of your own agents in your own company? Well, the best way to overcome that, or one of the ways to overcome that, is to have the seller initial the offer from Mount Sac Realty that you want to reject. Or, which I like better, okay, this is my recommendation, but I'm old. I come from the days where we did direct presentation. And what you can do is you can call the other agents in a multiple offer situation, and you can say, hey, we're in a multiple offer situation. I wanted to give you a heads up in case you want to go back to your buyer and strengthen your offer. That's a very nice, gentle way of saying, if you want to go back to your buyer and raise the price, right? Strengthen your offer. Nice way of saying that. And then go on to say, we will be presenting, or I will be presenting offers to my seller this evening. I'm giving all of the agents an opportunity that if you would like to come over and present the offer to the seller and myself, we can arrange a time. If you don't want to do that, I'll be happy to present the offer on your behalf. You see, if you give them that opportunity and their offer doesn't get accepted, they had a chance to present the offer, okay? And if they did present the offer and the seller didn't accept their offer, that's on them and their buyer, right? You did everything you could to give them a fair shot, and it didn't work out. That way, a month, 2 months, 6 months from now, when you're writing an offer on one of their listings, they'll give you the same courtesy, right? They're going to deal straight with you. Because we do know that sometimes personalities in this business capsize the boat, right? All right, so moving on. Now we get into page 16. I want to get into this broker section a little bit. So the first thing you'll notice is that in the middle here, we have the area for the agent's signature. A is for the buyer's brokerage firm. B is for the seller's brokerage firm, right? And then underneath that, okay, you see, well, first of all, we've got place for 2 signatures if you've got 2 agents working on it. That's kind of nice, okay? If you have another company involved, it doesn't really happen with representation of buyers, right? We don't usually have 2 real estate offices or 2 real estate companies representing a buyer, but sometimes we have 2 real estate companies taking a listing, okay? So in those cases, we can attach the ABA form for the additional broker acknowledgement. But let's just keep this simple. We have 1 brokerage firm with the seller, 1 brokerage firm with the buyer, and we have 1 agent working for the brokerage company with the buyer, and 1 agent working with the brokerage company for the seller. Okay, so brokerage firm, say hypothetically eHomes, buy, put your signature, license number, date. Then underneath that, your email. And if you want, your text number. I don't like using text. I much rather you have an app on your phone to read your email. Texts are hard to save, and your broker is required to save copies of all substantive communications and forms for 3 years. So it's really easy to do with emails, not so easy to do with texts, right? Okay, so you put your email in there, and what that means is the other side, if they want to give notice or delivery to your buyer, they just have to email it to you. Likewise, for the seller's brokerage firm, that agent is going to put their email at the bottom so that all communications deliveries can be sent to that email. And once you send it to that email, delivery has been completed. That's it. What if you want to run everything through your TC? You have an alternate. So you can put an alternate email, and that's a great place for your TC. Or depending on how maybe you have a co-agent, maybe you have a partner, a team, or something like that. You can put your assistant or team member or something that as the alternate. Okay. So if you check, then delivery will be given to the alternate only. If not, then delivery should be given to both. Okay. We want to support communications. And then at the very bottom, we have the escrow acknowledgement. Okay. And how they are licensed either through Financial Protection Innovation, Insurance, or Department of Real Estate. And at the very bottom, presentation of the offer. I think this is a little superfluous because you already had a space earlier where the seller could sign the rejection, but maybe you have a seller that doesn't want to sign the rejection. You can initial here, meaning that I just initial the rejection. That's what the seller does, initial, doesn't sign. But you can initial here that you did actually present. Remember, in Article 1 of the NAR Code of Ethics, there is a standard of practice that if you represent that you presented to a party and you didn't present, you can lose your realtor membership. And the consequence of losing your realtor membership is you're not going to have access to CAR forms, basically. Okay, so you definitely don't want to do that.